I want you to imagine for just a second a really modern, quiet, weekly religious ritual. You're sitting in a pew, it's peaceful, maybe a little somber, and heads are bowed.
Right, the typical Sunday morning scene.
Exactly. People are
Yeah.
passing around these small trays of bread and water.
Yeah.
It feels incredibly gentle, right?
Yeah.
But what if I told you that this quiet moment is actually based on a 3,000-year-old ancient survival meal?
Yeah, a meal eaten in the dead of night.
Right, in the middle of a completely hostile empire.
Yeah.
Right before this terrifying massive escape.
It really, it completely shatters the illusion that these weekly traditions are just these passive moments of reflection. I mean, when you look at the historical context, anyone participating in that modern ritual is actually echoing a massive, desperate, and bloody historical rescue.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We want to look at how that massive transition happened. So for this deep dive, we're looking at ancient texts in Exodus alongside some really fascinating modern commentary.
Yeah, specifically, we have this profound address on hope by a religious leader named Joseph B. Wirthlin and some historical analysis from a theology channel called Scripture Insights.
Right, and our mission today is to trace this complete chronological timeline of salvation. We're starting with an ancient prefiguration in Egypt, following it to a cross in Jerusalem, and finally landing on that modern weekly ritual you might see today.
Because to even begin to understand the modern application, we really have to start with the origin story in ancient Egypt. We have to establish the context of why this specific symbol, a lamb, was chosen in the first place.
Yeah, you have to set the stage of what the Israelites were actually experiencing.
Exactly. I mean, they had been trapped in this brutal, multi-generational bondage in Egypt for hundreds of years. They're an enslaved underclass in a terrifyingly powerful empire. And according to the Exodus text, God decides it's finally time to deliver them.
But the deliverance isn't instantaneous, is it?
No, not at all.
Far from it. The text describes this series of 9 epic plagues. And I really want to pause on those plagues because, well, we usually think of them as just a list of, I don't know, magic tricks.
Right, like something out of a movie.
Yeah, but they were catastrophic.
Yeah.
We are talking about the Nile River, the literal lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture, turning to blood. Swarms of locusts devouring every single green thing in sight.
Effectively destroying the national food supply?
Exactly. And darkness so thick it paralyzed the entire society for days.
Mm-hmm.
From a purely logical standpoint, any one of these should have been enough to make Pharaoh, like the most powerful man on earth at the time, completely surrender.
You would certainly think so. I mean, from a human perspective, 9 catastrophic plagues dismantling the ecology and economy of Egypt, that should have been the ultimate show of force.
Right.
But the narrative in Exodus makes a very deliberate theological point here. All of that spectacular worldly power falls woefully short. 9 plagues, and the Israelites are still slaves. The text is setting up a scenario where there is only one source of deliverance that finally works. And it wasn't the spectacular, earth-shattering plagues. It was just the blood of a lamb.
I always found that contrast so fascinating. Like, the plagues are this massive flex of cosmic power. But the thing that actually breaks the chains of slavery is incredibly intimate and, quiet.
That contrast is the entire point, really. By having 9 awe-inspiring plagues fail and the 10th succeeds solely through the blood of a lamb, the ancient text establishes this foundational theological truth.
Which is?
There is no backup plan for salvation. Deliverance, at least in this framework, doesn't come through dramatic worldly events or overwhelming displays of force. It comes exclusively through this very specific, seemingly humble sacrifice.
Okay, let's unpack this for the listener, especially if you're trying to explain this to a non-Christian friend. Think about it like hijacking a modern holiday.
Hijacking a holiday.
Yeah, imagine sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner with your friends and family. The whole meal is deeply symbolic, right? It is meant to celebrate American history, the harvest, gratitude for survival, and the turkey is the centerpiece.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, imagine right before Uncle Bob carves the bird, someone stands up, points to the turkey, and says, "From now on, this turkey represents what I am about to do for you."
Oh, wow. That would be incredibly jarring.
All right.
People at the table would think the person had completely lost touch with reality.
Yeah.
You don't just overwrite centuries of cultural tradition like that.
But that is the exact mechanism of what Jesus did, according to the theological text we're looking at. I mean, he took the Passover, a meal that Jewish people had been eating for over 1,000 years to celebrate their literal escape from Egypt, and he completely hijacked the symbolism.
He really did.
He sat at the table and essentially said, This isn't about Egypt anymore. This is about what I'm doing for you right now.
And to fully grasp why he did that, you have to look at what Egypt represented to the ancient Israelites. It wasn't just, a political state they disliked. To them, Egypt was a symbol of hell.
The ultimate symbol of death and spiritual bondage.
Exactly. When they observed the original Passover, they were passing through the literal shadow of death.
Hmm?
And when they finally fled and crossed the Red Sea, walking through those parted waters wasn't just some convenient physical escape route.
Right. The commentary we're reviewing highlights that this was seen as baptism.
Yes. It was a symbol of physical and spiritual resurrection. They were literally leaving their old, dead lives behind in the water and emerging on the other side as a newly born people.
And that concept of a newly born people brings up a detail in Exodus I had completely glossed over before. God actually tells them to make this month, the month of the Passover, called Abib, the first month of their year.
Yeah. He forces them to change their entire calendar.
Which is wild. Why go to the trouble of restructuring their whole concept of time?
Because it forces a psychological break from their era of slavery. It is a divine signal that overcoming death and sin doesn't just fix a temporary problem. It brings a completely new beginning.
A total reset.
Right. It is the start of a brand new calendar of your existence. The theological argument here is that applying the sacrifice results in literal spiritual rebirth. You don't just go back to your old life with slightly better circumstances. You start at year 0.
Okay, so if the blood of the Lamb was the absolute only thing that worked to trigger this new beginning, we really need to look at the underlying logic of the exact rules God gave for this lamb.
Because they were very specific.
Incredibly specific. Reading through the commentary, you quickly realize these rules weren't just ancient culinary preferences. They were this incredibly detailed prophetic checklist for Jesus Christ's sacrifice centuries later.
The precision is what makes the text so compelling. Let's analyze the first requirement. The lamb had to be a male, 1-year-old, and completely without blemish.
Let me push back on that phrase for a second, because without blemish usually conjures up an image of a fluffy, perfectly white little lamb from a children's picture book.
Oh, sure.
But the text clarifies it doesn't mean pretty, does it?
Not at all. It means structural integrity. It couldn't have any physical defects. So no limp, no broken legs, no blindness, no disease.
Okay.
The coat could be spotted or gray, whatever, but the animal had to be biologically whole and healthy. And this specific requirement prefigures the theological concept of Christ as the flawless, sinless substitute.
So in the Christian framework, he had no spiritual blemishes or moral defects.
Exactly. He was a structurally perfect offering.
Then there's the cooking instruction, which I found fascinating just from a historical perspective. Exodus explicitly states the lamb could not be boiled. It had to be roasted whole, with its head, its legs, and its inner organs completely intact.
Which is a very deliberate choice.
Yeah, because if you look at the economics of the ancient Near East, meat was a massive luxury. Usually, if a family got their hands on meat, they would boil it in a stew.
Right, because boiling extracts every ounce of fat and flavor into the water.
Exactly. It allows you to stretch the calories and feed a large group of people with a very small amount of animal. Boiling makes total economic sense.
But roasting an animal whole is an extravagant, deliberate choice. And the mechanism of the symbolism here is crucial to understand. When you boil meat, it breaks down.
It falls off the bone.
Yeah, it falls off the bone, it mixes with the vegetables, and it loses its distinct identity. It becomes a fragmented stew.
It dilutes the reality of what you're actually eating.
Precisely. But roasting the animal whole forces the participants to confront the distinct, unfragmented reality of the sacrifice. You are looking at the entire creature that gave its life for yours.
That's intense.
Theologians argue this requirement represents the complete, unfragmented nature of Christ's redemption. His sacrifice wasn't piecemeal, it wasn't diluted or divided up. It was a complete, whole offering of himself, body and spirit, to cover the totality of human sin and sorrow.
But out of all the requirements, the rule that really stopped me in my tracks was this strict mandate.
Yeah.
No bone of it shall be broken.
Yes.
When you are butchering, preparing, and eating a whole animal in a hurry, breaking bones is just a natural part of the process, yet God strictly forbade it.
And the reason that detail is so heavily emphasized by the sources is how it plays out during the Roman crucifixion roughly 1,500 years later. To understand the connection, you have to understand the brutal physiology of crucifixion.
Right.
It is a method of execution designed to kill primarily through asphyxiation.
Because the victim's arms are stretched out, making it incredibly difficult to expand the lungs.
Yes. To draw a breath, the victim has to push up on the nails in their feet. It is an agonizing cycle of pushing up to breathe and then collapsing in pain. Therefore, if the executioners wanted to speed up the death-like, usually before the Sabbath or a holy day, they would take a heavy club and shatter the victim's lower legs.
Because if the legs are broken, they can't push up.
Right. The victim can no longer push up, and asphyxiation follows within minutes.
It's just a horrific historical reality. But this brings us directly to the execution of Jesus.
It does. The gospel accounts record that the Roman soldiers came to Jesus and the two thieves beside him with the explicit intention of breaking their legs to finish the execution before the Passover began. They break the legs of the first man and the second.
But when they came to Jesus,
they found he had already died. He had already yielded up his spirit, and because he was already dead, there was no need to break his legs.
that is a wild historical collision. You have Roman execution protocols carried out by soldiers who likely knew absolutely nothing of Jewish scripture, inadvertently fulfilling an ancient Hebrew culinary rule. Not a single bone of the ultimate Passover lamb was broken.
It creates a really powerful narrative of prophetic fulfillment. But, even with all of these perfect, unblemished details, we have to address a critical mechanism of the Exodus story.
What's that?
Well, having this perfect lamb and successfully catching its blood in a basin that actually didn't save anyone, did it?
Oh, that's the kicker. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Wow.
The Israelites couldn't just sit in their living rooms, look at a bowl of blood on the table and say, well, God provided the sacrifice, we're good to go.
Oh, no, they couldn't.
The Exodus text is incredibly clear. They had to take a specific plant, a hyssop branch, which is bushy and acts almost like a natural sponge or paintbrush, dip it into the blood, and actively paint it onto the doorposts and the lintel of their homes. Only after they performed that physical action did the blood become a protective token.
And this detail completely dismantles the idea of passive salvation in this theology. The hyssop represents the explicit action required by the believer.
Right.
The framework suggests that Jesus Christ provided the infinite sacrifice. He filled the basin, so to speak. But the believer must actively apply his atonement to their own life.
Otherwise, it doesn't do anything for them.
Exactly. If they don't take the hyssop branch of faith, repentance, and making covenants to mark their own lives with his sacrifice, the destroying angel, the spiritual destruction, will not pass over them. The protective barrier requires participation.
Which brings our conversation directly to the modern day. If the hyssop was how the ancient Israelites applied the protective blood to their physical homes, how do you and I apply it today? Because we obviously aren't out there painting our front doors.
The sources, particularly the theological analysis we're looking at, argue that the modern sacrament or communion, depending on your tradition, is essentially a mini Passover.
A mini Passover, I like that.
Yeah, it is the modern equivalent of the hyssop branch. Remember, Jesus instituted the sacrament during a literal Passover meal. He took the elements that were already sitting on the table, and he swapped the lamb's blood for wine or water, saying it represented his blood, and he swapped the unleavened bread for his body.
We really need to pause and acknowledge how intensely jarring that concept was for the people sitting in the room with him.
Oh, absolutely.
In the ancient Jewish world, drinking blood was considered an absolute taboo. It was strictly forbidden in the law of Moses. Blood represented the literal life force of a creature, and consuming it was unthinkable.
The taboo was so strong that a few decades later, early Christians faced severe persecution because rumors spread among the Romans that they were actual cannibals.
Wait, really?
Yes. The Romans, hearing snippets of Christian theology, genuinely believed these groups were meeting in secret to literally eat the flesh and drink the blood of their murdered leader.
I mean, it sounds like a horror cult to an outsider.
It does. But Jesus is intentionally flipping the script. He is essentially saying, yes, blood is the life force, and because you are spiritually dying, you need my life force inside of you to survive.
Wow.
By partaking of the bread and water, the believer is internalizing his sacrifice. They are applying the blood to the doorposts of their own soul.
But realizing that theological weight brings up a massive psychological friction for the modern participant.
It really does.
Let's talk about the psychological experience of actually sitting in that pew during the sacrament.
Yeah.
If you are sitting there, what are you usually thinking about?
Usually, your own shortcomings.
Right. For a lot of people, they are agonizing over their mistakes from the past week. I lost my temper with my kids. I wasn't kind to my coworker. I gave in to that addiction again. It becomes this intense, heavy guilt trip.
Yeah.
It's like turning what is supposed to be a victory parade into a miserable courtroom of self-judgment.
That courtroom analogy is painfully accurate for many believers. But what's fascinating here is if you look back at the original Passover instructions in Exodus, God never once tells the Israelites, sit down to this meal and recount all the ways you failed me this week.
Oh, that's true.
He doesn't ask them to focus on their flaws or inventory their sins. He explicitly commands them to remember what he did for them. Remember that I brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand.
Wait, in theory that sounds beautiful, but isn't human nature wired to obsess over our mistakes? Like, if you've just messed up terribly at work or as a parent, how do the sources suggest you actually bypass that intense guilt and pivot to celebrating someone else's perfect eternity? It feels almost, I don't know, irresponsible to just stop feeling guilty.
It is entirely counterintuitive to human nature, which is why it requires a deliberate shift in perspective. The theology asserts that focusing endlessly on your own failures often just breeds paralyzing shame. And shame makes you want to hide, not improve.
Right, you just spiral.
Exactly. But focusing on his perfect rescue mission, celebrating the fact that even though you had a terrible week, God has a perfect eternity, fills you with awe and gratitude.
It shifts the focus.
It does. It provides the genuine spiritual fuel and motivation you need to actually change your behavior. You apply the atonement by remembering that the ultimate battle is already won, which gives you the courage to face your daily skirmishes.
But realizing you don't have to sit in guilt doesn't automatically solve the problem of real visceral suffering. When your life is actively falling apart, celebrating an ancient victory feels impossible.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the friction Joseph B. Wirthlin tackles in his address regarding the transition from Friday to Sunday.
To understand Wirthlin's argument, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of the disciples on the day of the crucifixion. It wasn't called Good Friday back then. For them, it was the darkest, most terrifying day in human history.
Let's set the scene of that Friday based on the historical and scriptural accounts. The earth literally shook. The massive veil of the temple was torn in half from top to bottom. The Savior of the world was mocked, beaten, publicly humiliated, and nailed to a cross to slowly suffocate.
It was horrific.
And his followers, they were absolutely devastated, thought the movement was entirely over. The man who they had seen walk on water, who they watched raise the dead, was hanging lifeless. From every observable metric, evil had completely won.
The despair they felt was absolute. I mean, their entire worldview had collapsed. But then, as Wirthlin emphasizes, Sunday arrived. The resurrection occurred. Christ stepped out of the tomb, becoming what the scriptures call the first fruits of the resurrection.
Okay, I'm looking at this term first fruits that Wirthlin uses. I've always heard that thrown around in religious settings.
Yeah.
But honestly, it just sounds like an archaic farming term to me. I'm assuming there's a deeper theological weight to it here than just, an early crop.
It is an agricultural metaphor, but it carries a profound guarantee. In an ancient agrarian society, the first fruits are the very first crops to ripen at the beginning of the harvest season.
Okay.
When a farmer sees those first fruits, it isn't just a sign of a few good plants. It is an absolute biological guarantee that the rest of the harvest is coming. By being the first fruits of the resurrection, Christ was the first to permanently break the biological and spiritual bands of death.
I see.
And according to this theology, his resurrection is the ultimate guarantee that the rest of the human harvest will inevitably follow.
Meaning that the promise extends to everyone. The theology posits that all of humanity, regardless of their status, will be resurrected and reunited with their loved ones in perfect, pain-free bodies. No more sickness, no more decay.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you right now? How does Wirthlin apply this cosmic event to the listener's personal life? Because we all have our personal Fridays, don't we?
We do. This raises an important question about suffering. We all experience days where the world seems to collapse around us.
I'm thinking of those dark moments of grief, like a terrifying medical diagnosis out of nowhere, the sudden loss of a job that jeopardizes your family, a profound betrayal, or a failure that makes you feel like your life is completely unfixable. You are sitting in the ashes of your own personal Friday, and it feels permanent.
And the central argument Wirthlin is making to his audience is a direct answer to that exact despair. He's arguing that the theology of the resurrection guarantees that Sunday will come.
Sunday will come.
Yes. In this framework, the resurrection isn't viewed as just a nice theological fable to make people feel better about dying. It is presented as the ultimate objective guarantee of hope.
Right.
It means that no matter how deep the darkness is right now, no matter how permanent the loss or the failure feels, Death and suffering do not possess the final word. Wirthlin's promise to his listeners is that because the ultimate Lamb was slain and resurrected, your personal Friday might be agonizing, but your Sunday of healing and restoration is an absolute certainty.
Wow. We have covered so much conceptual ground today. We have followed this unbroken thread of salvation, starting with a flawless lamb sacrificed during the brutal bondage of Egypt, to its blood actively painted on wooden doorposts with a hyssop branch.
A massive journey.
Right. We traced that exact symbolism to a wooden cross in Jerusalem, where the true lamb's bones remained historically unbroken. And finally, we followed it to the quiet bread and water of the modern sacrament.
When you lay it out chronologically like that, you really see the journey from an ancient prefiguration of physical survival to a modern weekly celebration of absolute spiritual victory.
And understanding that deep historical and theological context completely transforms how you might view that quiet weekly ritual. It shifts it from being a miserable courtroom where you judge your own mistakes into a powerful source of spiritual protection.
Yeah, a completely different perspective.
It becomes a weekly, tangible reminder that because of what happened on that ancient Friday and Sunday, your current trials, your pain, and even death itself are never the end of your story.
The theological texts we've explored today all point to one resounding conclusion, which is that the deliverance is already a reality, and the protective blood has already been provided.
Which leaves you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over this week. We talked about how the ancient Israelites couldn't just sit back and look at the blood in the basin.
Right, they couldn't be passive.
They had to physically take a hyssop branch and paint their own doors to show they accepted God's deliverance. The infinite sacrifice was made, but they had to deliberately opt in.
They had to take action.
Exactly. So, as you navigate your own life this week, what is the modern equivalent of that mark on the door for you?
Yeah.
How do you show the universe that you haven't just intellectually heard about this ultimate gift, but that you have actively applied it to the doorposts of your own life?